Hi, I've been baking bread for about 40 years. This is a recipe I came up with 30 years ago, and I typically bake bread every other week. I do 4 loaves. I'm going to go through a little bit of what I do. For the flour, you can use any combination. This is the one that works for me. I use 4.5 cups of bread flour because it's got higher gluten, 2 cups of wheat. If I want to add more than that in wheat, I need to add some gluten. I've also added oats, mixed nuts, sun nuts, all sorts of different things. I do the basic yeast, though I do have sourdough that I've had going for a few years, but that's a whole different recipe. You need 3 tablespoons of fat. It keeps the bread moist, gives it a richness. You can use lard, bacon grease, oil. I use butter in this recipe. 3 tablespoons of honey. Because we are beekeepers, I use honey, but you can use, for any kind of sweetener, you can use molasses, maple syrup, white sugar. I've often made an oat maple bread, and I'll use maple in place of honey, and I've also used molasses. In making French bread, you typically don't use salt because it's used to soak up savory dishes that have a lot of seasoning in them. And interestingly, Italian bread doesn't use any fat. I use a powdered milk, so I get 2 cups of a hot liquid. You could use beer, you could use just plain water, you could use whatever liquid you want. And this is my recipe. So we'll get going. Depending on the humidity and the heat, sometimes you'll use more flour and sometimes you'll use less. I did not have a mixer for about 25 years. This made a huge difference. Tablespoon of salt, because I like a little savory. And let's use up some honey. Have 8 gallons of honey. As a beekeeper, we get a lot. It's good for pollinating. You can tell the years our bees have done good with our apples. If big apples, you cut them in half. You see all of the seeds inside. And my favorite to use when I'm doing bread is crystallized honey because it's easy to scoop out. This one here is a little past crystallized, which honey will keep for years. They found some in the King Tut's tomb, and it was still edible. It's not something that goes bad. Add my fat, which I'm going with butter this time. And then I've pre-mixed my flour. And when I use the mixer, but I always end hand kneading because I like to feel when it's had enough flour. And I know that just by feel because I've done it for so many years. And that's a start. My yeast has been working. This is what it looks like. It only takes a few minutes. And you don't want to go through all this and then find out your yeast was no good. And this is what I call my slurry. Once I add everything into this, it's the start. And now I'll just add about 1/2 cup of flour at a time until I feel it's had enough with the machine, and then I'll hand knead it. That's going. I'll butter my bowls. I've been using these bowls for over 20 years. They're my go-to bowls. I always use butter. I find it releases better, and unless I'm using some other recipe that calls for a different type of fat, this has been my go-to. I will switch to a dough hook when it gets too thick. We're almost there. And I normally only use that for about a minute before I start hand kneading, which is my favorite part. I do have a fear of blenders. Back about 35 years ago, I got my fingers stuck in an old blender, and they bent all sorts of funny ways, and you could hear them cracking. And that's with a hand blender. Hand mixer. It is now about where it normally is when I pull out the hand knead. Stop to check it every once in a while. It's good. It's not quite where it should be. And it doesn't need any more flour. It's quite full. So I'll save that for batch number 2, which I already have the yeast going. And I do sprinkle a little sugar on there to feed the yeast to get it going. I've got my next batch of flour measured out. I've got the hot milk prepared. I try and get these done within a few minutes of each other, so when I roll it out in the pan, they're not too far behind each other. This is batch number 2, so it tends to get a little messy here. And the yeast is really working good. So I add in the yeast. I've added in my fat, butter, sugar, salt for savory. I've got some extra butter that's been melting for buttering the tops of the loaves. I have my bread towels. You can use saran wrap. And I prefer a slow rise. I think I get a better quality bread. Whip that up and I'll start adding flour. I've used these bread towels for about 20 years. And I'm careful when I wash them that there's no scent in them. I've decided to use the saran wrap today because I ran out of flour and had to pull some out of the freezer. So I want to keep in as much heat as I can from the hot milk to help it rise. Batch number 2. It's about where I like it to prepare hand mixing. I add a little extra flour before I spread it out. When I first started baking bread, I didn't have a mixer, and I started all the kneading from the very beginning. Just like a blues player, you get into a rhythm and go. And using the mixer now cuts my kneading time down by about 15 minutes, and I certainly appreciate that. And you can also really feel it when it's had too much flour, if it needs more. Yes, my stomach is growling for bread. Yeah, into the next bowl. Even though I opted to use saran wrap to conserve the heat because I used some very cold flour, I've always used these towels to mark batch number 1. And this towel will always mark batch number 2. It's just a habit I've had for 20 years. We've been rising now for only about 40 minutes, and you can see batch number 1 is looking really good. Batch number 2 is a little behind, so what I might do is I might let batch number 1 go a little farther with the rise so batch number 2 can catch up, and then I'll roll them out. I've always buttered my pans. I've used glass pans because a lot of my dishes were inherited to me from my grandmother, and that's just what she had. And before I bake bread, I go through each pan and inspect it to make sure that there are no new chips or anything that might cause alarm. And I have used oil and other fats, and I had a hard time getting the bread out, and I found just using butter, everything popped right out. This is one of my favorite parts that I enjoy doing, is when I plop it out of the bowl. And it started to kind of collapse a little bit because I was letting it go a little too long, but this is it, listen. Yeah, that's my favorite part. We were married 39 years ago this month. And when we were first married, we lived in an Amish community, and the women there forked their bread to remove the bubbles. I have done it this way. I don't know where I learned it. I've just done it this way for almost 40 years of rolling it out. I cut the dough almost in half because one bread pan's bigger than the other. I have 2 smaller bread pans and 2 larger glass. And sometimes you can tell if I've not let it rise enough, you'll get stretch marks on it. This looks like it's going to be pretty good. So I roll it in the third, and you want to get them air bubbles out. So this is where you just really start to roll tight. And I could see one bubble coming up there, and I kind of poke it with my fingers, keeping them air bubbles out. Every once in a while you get to the end and you get a little air bubble, and then just kind of roll in the ends. Now there are so many ways of baking bread. This is just how I've done it and been successful. I put it in my dish, and when I'm all done, I'll take a knife, I'll score the top. I've always done 3. And then I butter the top. And then I'll let it rise again, typically about an hour. Put it in the oven. Be hungry, pull it back out. So that is 1 of 4. We got 3 more to do. See, this one's a bigger one. Wish I could remember where I learned this. My grandfather and his brother owned a bakery shop. My grandfather was a baker, but I didn't learn any of these things from them. They were gone when I got married. Married young, we were kids, we were dirt poor, and hauled water, lived by a little wood stove, cooking potatoes in the stove. And butter was a luxury, so I don't even think we used butter then. And we certainly didn't have honey. We started beekeeping about 15 years ago or so. And I think I said I had 8 gallons of honey. That's just in one spot. I think I got another 10 to 12 in a whole nother spot. Like the bees, I tend to hoard. And the honey, we'll get different colors. We'll get, in the spring, we'll get some basswood honey, which I hoard for oolong tea, and in the fall we get a darker, richer honey, and that's typically what I use for baking. The bread has risen pretty good. I've had it rise more in the past, but I'm afraid if I let it go too much longer, it will collapse, so I'm going to put them in. Oh boy, this smells so good. And this is how easy they come out, just like that. Put it outside till I get all 4 of them out. I don't know why, just have it. Another one. These ones typically are a little smaller. Ooh, this pad's getting hot. See how easily they just come out with butter? If I used oil, it doesn't come out as good. Put this in the back. And I flip them up. And I'll give it a buttered top, which, besides a little flavoring, all that does is it brings out color and softens it, unless you prefer a crispy topping, which is just fine too. The hard part is waiting 20 minutes. It'll still be warm, but you don't want to go into it too early, because the steam is still letting, steam inside is helping the bread to finish cooking. If you let that out, you could ruin a good piece of bread. I've got new butter brushes my daughter's bought me. I'm kind of partial to this old doozy. Figured it's still got a few bristles left on it. I test the bread when it's done by a hollow sound, compared to when it's not all the way done. It's kind of more of a thump. Give this 20 minutes and we'll slice into it. Turned out pretty good from my end. Smells wonderful. And this is normally when my family will show up too. Who doesn't like fresh baked bread? I'll put 3 in the freezer and we'll eat a half loaf in one setting. We typically cut into the prettiest one, but we're gonna go with this one. And it's been, and this bread is so soft. It's been about 25 minutes. My husband typically likes the end. It's just so soft cutting it, but there you go. And it really smells good, and I can't believe my family hasn't jumped in yet. My daughter and my husband like butter on it. Me, I like peanut butter, which I've got sitting out. It's just so soft. You're just crushing it trying to put butter on it. There we go. Fresh baked bread. Fairly easy to do. My family came in and scooped up bread so fast. This one's mine. Just rewards.